Hey everyone, my name is Dan and I make competitive Warhammer 40K content. Today we're going to be talking about one of my favorite topics, and that is trying to figure out who is the aggro in your game of Warhammer 40K. So first we have to define that term. The idea of aggro is someone who's on the offense, who has to change the state of the game. I think far too often people will be playing a melee army against a shooting army and conflating the idea that being melee means that you are the aggro and have to go towards your enemy, and that actually is not the case in Warhammer 40k. So it reminds me of a story. I was watching a stream a few years ago at the Las Vegas Open. That's the biggest Warhammer 40k tournament in the entire world. And it was near the top tables. It was a streamed match, and each player was just essentially ending their turn. It was only a few minutes into the game, and both players just said, "Oh, I end my turn. Oh, I end my turn." And it was at about turn 3 that one of the people, you could hear him say over the stream, "Oh wait, I think I'm gonna lose." But basically, he was so worried that if he went out into the open, he would get shot. So he said, "I'm just gonna, stand back and make my opponent come to me." But at the end of the day, his opponent never had to come to him and was able to win the game by just passing his turn. It's very possible that in some of your games where you were playing that you felt like you got shot off the board and you had to go towards your enemy, you actually didn't even have to do that. So if you guys are playing with the Grand Tournament 2021 pack, you'll know that there's two ways you can score points. The first is by standing on objectives in any type of mission. The second is by scoring your secondary objectives, which you pick from a set of different secondaries. If you want to know more about those secondaries, I've got a video on that as well. Okay, so it's pretty easy to understand how you score primaries. You sit on different objectives, at the beginning of your turn you get some points. And then the secondary objectives you get through a variety of different means. Some of them involve you standing in your opponent's deployment zone, or standing across, the 4 different quarters of the map, doing objectives in your opponent's quarters. But some of them are a lot more passive. Some of them involve killing your opponent's models. Some of them involve doing actions in the center of the field. Some of them even involve holding objectives in your own backfield. So there's kind of a gradient of how close you even have to get to your opponent to score these secondary objectives. We can kind of group them as objectives that are offensive, meaning you need to go towards your opponent's deployment zone, or defensive, where you can stay in your half of the board. One of the examples I use all the time is To the Last. That's a secondary objective that gives you 15 points if you end the game with your 3 highest costing units. Maybe you pair that with Psychic Ritual, which involves doing psychic actions only 6 inches away from the center. And then maybe you add another one that's a little bit more defensive. Let's say you pick this mission-specific secondary like Priority Targets, and you're able to get 3 points a turn on your backfield and still max out 15 points while never leaving your own deployment zone. Now let's compare that to more offensive secondaries, like Behind Enemy Lines, Engage on All Fronts, Retrieve Octarius Data. It can be pretty clear that if one person has all defensive secondaries and one person has all offensive secondaries, if they're at parity with primary, then the person with the defensive secondaries is going to win if they just continuously end their turn and the offensive person continuously ends their turn. I think it's pretty clear in that scenario that the person taking offensive secondaries is the aggro. They have to move forward, otherwise they'll lose. It doesn't matter if they're melee or ranged, they have to change the state of the game. But okay, I hear you. Games are a little more complicated than who wins or loses if no one does anything. So what I'd like to do with you is share a different way of looking at who's the aggro. Because once more, the way I tried to define the aggro is the person who has to change the current state of the game, has to break away from the status quo. Let's say we pick a different example, like Sweep and Clear. On this map, you have 5 different objectives, and one of them is in the center. Sweep and Clear also has a really powerful mission-specific secondary that gives you 3 points at the end of your turn if you control the center objective. Another secondary that's really good to pair with that is Stranglehold. That'll give you 3 points at the end of your turn again if you control 3 objectives and more than your opponent. And then you can imagine also pairing that with Oath of Moments, which is a Space Marine secondary that gives you 2 points at the end of your turn if you're within 6 inches of the center with a unit. You can see that all 3 of those secondaries work really well together to hold that center objective. Let's say 2 Space Marine players are playing against each other and they pick the exact same secondaries. So Stranglehold, Direct Assault, and Oath of Moments. Who is the aggro in this case? Well, it's actually the person who goes first. The reason why is that Oath of Moments, unlike the other secondaries, scores at the end of the battle round. So now, instead of people just sitting in their deployment zones, let's imagine a scenario where both players are playing very cagey and kind of hiding as much as they can, only putting their cheapest model on the center objective, killing whatever their opponent had, and then staying still. So it's kind of like swapping off for who has control of the center objective while also trying to lose the least amount of points. This is the status quo of this game based on the secondaries. But if blue plays into that and they're going first, what will happen is that they will constantly be behind in points because red is always going to be scoring at the end of the battle round, which is when Oath of Moments is scored. So at the end of the game, if you just kept swapping back and forth, blue would have 30 points from secondaries, while red would have at least 40. So who's the aggro? Well, blue in this case. But let's take this a little bit further. I know what some of you are going to say. I don't play Space Marines, I don't take Oath of Moments, and I don't need to score at the end of the battle round, so this is all wrong. And please bear with me here. So let's change up the scenario just a little bit. Okay, let's say blue and red both are taking that same type of direct assault and stranglehold secondaries. So it's still an exchange over the middle for who's controlling it. But let's imagine a scenario where blue is running an elite army and red is running an army with lots of chaff. If blue throws their 200-point model on, red clears it off and replaces it with a 60-point model. If blue and red kept trading like this, around turn 3 or turn 4, red could just move their entire army on, and now that they have a massive points advantage over blue. So who's the aggro in that scenario? It's the person who's at a disadvantage by trading. So now we know we kind of have about 3 different questions we have to ask ourselves to figure out who the aggro is in a certain game. Of course, it's going to depend on the actual mission, but the way I like to ask myself first is, if nobody did anything and just ended their turn, who would win? Pretty easy to calculate based on the secondaries and primaries. The second question to ask yourself is, are you at an inherent disadvantage by going either first or second? Generally, the person going second is going to be at an advantage for end of round scoring. The player going second also has an advantage in scoring primaries. If you remember, the rules were changed so that the second player scores at the end of the round on turn 5. That gives them a massive advantage in scoring primaries and also pushes them to be the defensive player while the first turn player is the offensive player. Now, it's not always the case, but it is something you have to take into account. The third question I like to ask is, who's getting better trades? Now, we can't always use points because points aren't perfect, but you have to ask yourself, by turn 3 or turn 4, am I going to have way less troops and not even be able to compete against my opponent anymore? Because if that's the case, you need to do something else besides just take pot shots and trade with your opponent. So what can we do? Well, we can actually try to just push out and hold as much terrain as we can. For example, let's say we go back to that sweep and clear objective. One thing that blue can try to do if they're going first and they've identified themselves as the aggro is to push forward and hold objectives for the minimum amount of time needed. So in the sweep and clear example, that would be holding the center objective for 3 turns. If they do that, even if they lose their entire army in the middle and just hold a couple back objectives with some chaff units, and red is able to dominate on turn 4 and turn 5, they will still have the winning advantage in secondary points. But maybe blue can't compete with red by just pushing all their forces in the middle of the board. Maybe they have to change the rules of the game. And what I mean by that is, don't play into the playstyle your opponent wants you to do. So in this example, if you can't fight over the center objective with your opponent because he has so much obsec, maybe he's Necrons with that double obsec thing, and you just cannot hold the middle objective, don't even try. Take secondaries that involve getting to your opponent's deployment zone or spreading out. Maybe only focus on taking the bottom right or top right objective. But whatever you do, do not play into the strategy that gives your opponent a win. And that's what the offensive player has to do. What about the defensive player? Well, it's a lot more simple. They need to not take unnecessary risks. If you're already going to win, if you don't do anything, then you should play defensively. Why overextend or allow your units to get shot if you don't need them to? Make your opponent come to you or go out of cover first so you can take the first shots. I don't blame people for wanting to run forward, roll dice, charge the enemy, but sometimes, even if you're the Blood Angels player, you're on the defense. And if you want to know more tips like this and want to talk to a community who's always trying to get better, you can join me on my Patreon, which I'll have a link below. And if you're interested, I make plenty of other videos where I go over Warhammer 40K tactics. So I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you have a wonderful day.
Fight.